Hi everybody, it's Victoria. We are today doing the video of the year, the top 10 books that I read in 2019. And I have to say 2019 was my best reading year of my entire life as far as number of books that I read. I would say this was an extremely successful year. Yay for 2019. Hopefully 2020 can be just as good and maybe even better, but I will say I read a lot of variety, and my list really reflects that. I read a lot of different genres, different ones that I'm used to reading, and so let's go ahead and just jump right in and talk about all of my favorite books of 2019. I'm actually going to start this list with an honorable mention book because I only read 2 classics this year, but I really loved both of them. However, this particular classic had some things that I didn't like as much, but I still really enjoyed it, and I really wanted to include it on this list, but out of the 10 slots, it just didn't quite make it. So this is coming in at number 11 as an honorable mention, and that is Far from the Madding Crowd by Thomas Hardy. I read this book very early in the year. I want to say actually in January or February, probably January actually, and it is a beautiful novel about a woman who is really different than a lot of other women in her particular time. She is very headstrong. She is an independent businesswoman, and she constantly has these suitors, and she has particularly 3 different suitors that kind of vie for her attention. And in this book you see how she struggles to maintain her independence as a woman, as a businesswoman, and then managing these men who fall in different categories to her and different categories in her life. And I found it just to be a really interesting character study. Our character's name is Bathsheba Everdeen, and yes, that is what inspired Katniss Everdeen, which is also a series that I read, but we'll get into that later. But that was really interesting to me, the idea of this independent woman in this very not modern society in this rural place, and women are expected to do one thing, and she is very much breaking the mold. So I really enjoyed that aspect of this classic. What brings this down for me a little bit is the melodramatic characters. I just felt like they were a little bit too dramatic, and Thomas Hardy kind of portrays women in a little bit of an insulting way sometimes, which he is a product of his time for sure. This is a is this Victorian novel? I believe it's a Victorian novel. I really love Thomas Hardy. I love his writing. I had read a couple of things by him before, and so I knew I liked this author's writing, and his statements about society are really interesting. I didn't always love how he portrayed women, and the other thing that brought this down for me a little bit was the very lengthy pastoral descriptions that kind of go on and on and on a little bit, and kind of take some tangents away from the story, I felt. But I really liked this classic. I definitely want to keep pursuing more Thomas Hardy books. There's, I think one really famous one that I haven't read yet. I've read The Mayor of Casterbridge, which I read that in high school and I remember really liking it. So honorable mention, Thomas Hardy. Really liked it. Looking forward to rereading it again in the future and to reading more Thomas Hardy. Coming in at the number 10 slot is going to be the Percy Jackson series, but I'm just going to hold up this first book, The Lightning Thief, Percy Jackson, and the Olympians. I read all 5 of these books this year and really enjoyed them. I had never read Rick Riordan before, and he's an extremely popular author, so I really wanted to give him a go, and I'm definitely hooked. I'm going to be picking up more Rick Riordan in the future for sure. I want to continue with the spin-off series and his different worlds of the Greek gods, and I think he's so creative. I think he's really figured out how to write for that middle grade audience. I often feel like there's a lot more middle grade books that are targeted towards young girls rather than young boys, just because I think there's a stigma that boys don't read, and boys definitely do read, and there's lots of boys that enjoy reading, and I think this is just the perfect series, especially for a young boy. This is about a young boy named Percy Jackson, and he thinks he's a normal boy, but he one day discovers that he has some special powers that he kind of took for granted and didn't really think about, but he actually is the son of Poseidon, the god of the sea. And so he can breathe underwater. He is a very good swimmer. Percy Jackson also has dyslexia. He has trouble focusing in school, so he's a very relatable protagonist, I think, for a lot of kids. And I just really appreciated that about this book, that I think a lot of kids can see themselves in Percy Jackson, and they have a hero they can root for. So Percy Jackson discovers that he keeps getting visited by some mythological creatures who are changing the course of his life and his destiny, and so we follow him on his adventures as he figures out how to navigate life as a half-human, half-god. What a charming story, what a funny story. Rick Riordan is so good at writing humor, humor especially for kids, but it's also clever humor for adults. Adults can enjoy this too. I just thought it was so well crafted, it had to make my list. Number 9 on my list was actually a new release book that came out this year, and I knew about it and I really wanted to pick it up right away, and it did not disappoint. I'm very glad I picked it up, and that was The Bookish Life of Nina Hill by Abby Waxman. This book is one of those books that someone in my age range can really see themselves in the similar way that I think a young child could see themselves in Percy Jackson. I saw myself in Nina Hill. Nina Hill is 29 years old. I'm 29 years old. And she loves books. She works in a bookstore in Los Angeles. And she just has this perfect little life that she's created for herself. She has her apartment. She has her cat. And she just loves her life the way it is. She's on a trivia team, she has friends, and she is just kind of living her best late 20s life. However, some things start to happen in her life. She has some unexpected family members that she didn't know existed come into her life. There's a bit of a romance in this book. There's a love interest who's on another trivia team and who's interested in her. And so in this book, Abby kind of fights the idea of change in her life versus she wants to keep everything the same because she's comfortable where she's at. But in this book, we find that change is inevitable, and Nina has to learn how to deal with that. And I found this book just to be honestly like a mirror into my own life. It came really at the perfect time. It was a nice summer read. I read it in summer on vacation, and it was just a good time. And it's just really kind of warm and fuzzy, and it makes you feel good. So really enjoyed this Bookish Life of Nina Hill. Check it out. I definitely want to read more by this author. This is the first book I had ever read by this author, so would love to pick up more by Abby Waxman. In spot number 8 on my list, it's going to be a mystery thriller, sci-fi thriller, and I actually made an attempt this year to try to read some thrillers because it's not a genre I really ever pick up. I don't know what it is, because I do enjoy reading a thriller that's good, of course, but I don't tend to want to purchase them or want to pick them up. I don't know why. Just the premises always kind of sound the same to me, especially with domestic thrillers. I feel like a lot of them kind of sound the same. However, I haven't read enough to really know, so I shouldn't talk about that. But I really liked the premise of this one, and I knew about the author. This is Recursion by Blake Crouch. So I'd seen the author around on different people's videos, particularly with the book Dark Matter is a really popular one of his. And this one came out this year. This was another new release book, part of my goal to read some new release books this year. And I'm really glad I picked this up. It was definitely worth the money. It was a really fun romp. It has a really interesting concept. So this book is about memory, and these people are waking up one day with memories that they don't necessarily own. So one day they just wake up remembering a family that they never had. So you remember a daughter, or you remember a wife, or a relationship, or a job that you never have, but they have these memories somehow, and you're trying to figure out why. And you follow two main characters, kind of goes back and forth. It's sort of dual perspective. We have Barry Sutton, who is a cop, and he's investigating, when we meet him, a suicide from someone who killed themselves, threw themselves over a building because they had these false memories and they couldn't deal with it because their life is not matching up with our memories. So they're freaking out about that, and so he's investigating that. More and more they're finding people complaining about this problem. And then we also follow Helena Smith, who's a neuroscientist, and she has really dedicated her whole life to creating a technology that will help preserve memories, because she has a mother, I believe. It's been a while since I read it, but a mother, I think, who has Alzheimer's. So that's her line of work, her line of study, is memory and how to preserve memories, especially because it's very personal to her, because her mom is losing her memories with Alzheimer's. And you follow them separately for a while, and then of course their stories will intertwine eventually. And I just found this to be, I never knew what was going to happen. It's a page turner. It's just a lot of storylines and a lot of different like timelines, and it's really, I thought, well done. It's a complex story without seeming complex. It was very easy to read, but there was a lot going on. It wasn't particularly hard to follow, but it was always surprising. And so Recursion definitely sold me on this author. Again, I will be picking up more from Blake Crouch. I gotta get my hands on a copy of Dark Matter. Would love to see what else this author has to offer. In spot number 7, I have the other classic that I read. I only read 2, but I really thought this one was just so spooky and creepy and thought-provoking, and that was We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. You're following the main character, Mary Cat, and Mary Cat is narrating the story, and through her narration, you kind of start to pick up on some clues that Mary Cat's not all there, and their family is very much sequestered in this house. Sometimes Mary Cat goes into the village, and you see the village people really discriminate against her, and they're very rude to her, and they say things about her family, and they're not very nice to them. So you're kind of trying to figure out, why do the village people feel this way about Mary Cat? Mary Cat is very protective of her family. She does some strange things, like she buries items to hide away. She will bury money in the backyard. She does strange things. So you know pretty early on that something's a little bit off with Mary Cat, and so you gradually uncover what went on behind closed doors in this house, what the family dynamics are. I really enjoyed the process of uncovering little things here and there and figuring out what happened. And I enjoyed reading the weird family dynamics and like the weird things that they would say, and it was just a good mental ride. Shirley Jackson's really famous for The Haunting of Hill House, which is another story that I would love to pick up. I've heard the Netflix version of that is actually really good, but really different than the book, but that it's really good. So Shirley Jackson is another author I will be looking into further. Just really liked this one. The next books I have to talk about, well, really one book, but kind of 2 books. This year I finished reading The Hunger Games. I know. What took me so long? I had never read them before. for some reason. I didn't read a lot in a certain like age because I was very busy with school and I just didn't read very much. And now I'm catching up to the 21st century, and I finished Catching Fire and I finished Mockingjay by Suzanne Collins. My favorite one was Catching Fire, so I'm going to talk about this one mostly. I thought for being a second book in a series, this is so good. It opens the world up so much more. It deepens the characters. We get to see where they come from and where they're going. I'm going to do my best not to spoil anything because just in case you don't know the story, like I didn't, I don't want to spoil it for you, but this book I think really just opens up the world in a different way, and I just thought it was really well done. I fell in love with the characters a lot more. I understood the characters a lot more. And so this was a great second book. It's hard, I think it's hard to write a second book in a trilogy. Sometimes they feel like just a bridge into the third book, but this really felt like it stood very well on its own as its own story, and I loved it. In spot number 5, we have a historical fiction novel. I told you this list was going to be very varied, very varied. And so we have The Nightingale by Kristen Hanna. I loved this book. It made me cry. Any book that makes me cry is gonna make my top 10 list. Let's just be honest. This is about World War II. It follows 2 sisters in World War II. And this book really follows the stories of these 2 women, and it gives you a picture into what women may have been doing during World War II. Some of them were homemakers at home and dealing with the ramifications of how their lives changed at home. And then some of them had a little bit more of an active role in helping with the war efforts, in helping their country. And so you follow 2 different sisters. One sister is more of the homemaker, and one of them is out there in the world doing specific things for the war causes. And so I don't want to say too much again because I don't want to spoil. A lot of times when a book follows 2 dual perspectives, I want to hear about one more than the other. Not the case with this one. I really enjoyed what I learned with both characters, and I enjoyed the different storylines and perspectives. Both of the storylines are very riveting, and I didn't necessarily want to be pulled away when they would kind of switch character perspectives. But this is just a fantastic World War II novel. I've read quite a few World War II novels now, and this is definitely going to be pretty high up there on my favorites list. And yeah, if you haven't read The Nightingale, do yourself a favor, pick it up. It is heartbreaking, but it's so good. So good. Number 4 on my list, we're going to go with Skyward by Brandon Sanderson. I finally picked up a Brandon Sanderson book this year. This is my first one that I had picked up so far, and I'm very happy I did. And I have Starsight on my shelf. I really wanted to try to finish it this year. It's not too late. Today is December 23rd, so I still have a little bit of time. I might be able to finish it. We'll see. But Skyward was, I thought, a really strong first novel in this, I think, 4-book series. Skyward follows Spensa, and Spensa lives in this futuristic world. They are terrorized by an alien force. They are sort of trapped on this planet. They all live underground because it's not safe to live above ground with the alien attacks all the time. And in this world, it's very honorable and desirable to become a pilot. And very few people make it in the pilot school. But Spensa has a family history of pilots. Her father was a pilot, and all she wants to do is be a pilot. However, her father has a bit of a taint on his name, and so there's some people who don't want Spensa to be in flight school because of her father's reputation. But in this book, we just really want Spensa to succeed. You're rooting for her the whole time. The world is a very interesting world. Interesting to learn about the different problems and the politics that are going on in this world. And I also felt like while Brandon Sanderson is really good at revealing things about the story to us while keeping the action going forward, there's never a lull in the story, at least not in this first book. It always moved forward. It was definitely a page turner. I appreciate his ability to move the plot forward and also build the characters and build their relationships together. I loved Spensa as a character. She is so fun to read about. She is very feisty. She's very fearless. And this is, I think, going to be a really great series to read. And I can't wait to read Starsight very, very soon. In spot number 3, we had one of my top anticipated books of the year, and it did not disappoint, and that was The Toll by Neal Shusterman. This is the 3rd book in the Arc of a Scythe trilogy, and this is a big old book, but it took me like 3 or 4 days to read it, and it's quite a chunky book, but I couldn't put it down. Once you start reading it, you can't stop. There's a lot of just hair-raising moments in this book that you have to just keep reading because you cannot put it down. And I just found the whole Arc of a Scythe trilogy is, to me, a very unique story, and it's a unique world. It's an interesting world, very complex, and I think Neal Shusterman does a really good job of explaining the world and making it feel really, really big. But you always kind of know what's going on. Similar to Brandon Sanderson. It's a large, complex world, but it's just really well-crafted book, really good storytelling. In our political climate, in our climate currently in the scientific world, there's a lot of things in this book that are maybe not even that far off. There is a lot to think about, and to think about, wow, what would society be like? How does death change? How does the presence of death in our life change how we act, how we function? If you took away death, how would that change the way society functions? Would it change it for the better or for the worse? I think you could just talk about the series and never get tired of talking about it, because it has so many different aspects and layers to it. We see how people deal with things in a good way. We see how people deal with things in a bad way. We see that there's going to be so many more issues when you make progress in society, and I think that is just really coming across really well in these books. That society is broken no matter what. Even if we think we fix society, it's still going to be broken, because there's going to be something else. So this is just, I think, a very thought-provoking book, which is why it's so high up on my list. I loved the series. The wrap-up of the series was very good. I will say I had a little bit of a struggle getting into it, because I think it takes a while to rebuild the world. I was very thankful to Neal Shusterman for reviewing a lot of things, because I had some gaps in my memory on some of the story. So at the beginning of the book, he does kind of remind you of things, and I appreciated that personally. But it does take a little while to get into the main plot and for things to go forward. But once they go forward, man, it gets crazy. Number 2 on my list is, it's really hard to pick just one of these books, but I'm just going to hold up A Wizard of Earthsea, because I did read all 6 of these books in this series this year. This is by Ursula K. Le Guin. I think the first book is a really solid entry, and it's a good example of the series. This is a world I'm very much looking forward to rereading and revisiting in the future, which is why it's number 2 on my list. These are books that I'm going to reread for sure eventually. And this is a classic fantasy young adult series. However, as the series goes, it definitely becomes less young adult and more adult. Ursula K. Le Guin writes like poetry, and I think that may work for you, it may not work for you. The characters often face a lot of moral dilemmas. There's always an element of spirituality in these books, which is a certain type of spirituality. It's not necessarily blatant always. Sometimes it is, but not always. And I found the weaving of the story and the morality and the spirituality in these books to be the real strength of these. I think you have a lot to think about. Again, that's why I think they're so easily rereadable, because there's a lot of layers to them that you can unpack. But the story follows Ged. Ged is a young man who is poor. He lives very simply with a simple life. He comes from a very simple background, but he exhibits some powers that he has. He has some just natural powers, and he learns how to hone those powers. He goes to a wizarding school, a little bit of wizarding school. It's, again, very, very tropey. There's a lot of tropes in this one, but just in the first one, and then the world is not so tropey later. He learns that he's very powerful in this first book, but he gets a little bit overconfident. He gets a little bit cocky, and he does something that haunts him for a long time, and honestly kind of will haunt him for the rest of his life, and he learns some valuable lessons, and it's just a good coming of age story. It's very deep, very thought-provoking. I love this whole series. There's a couple books that I like less, but I found this whole series just was so worthwhile. I'm glad that I read through kind of one after another, and I didn't lose steam with the series. I think that's a good way to go with this. The world is just a great world to get lost in. So, loved the Earthsea series very much. Spot number 2. Woo! And now, we have come to spot number 1. If you've been watching any of my recent videos, you probably know what spot number 1 is going to be. But that is, it surprised me because it's a nonfiction book, and I didn't expect that. But Unbroken by Laura Hillenbrand was the best book that I read this year. And I'll tell you why. This book made me think about my own life and my own faith, and what shakes my faith, what shapes my faith in God. And so Louis Zamperini was a Olympic runner. He was a bit of a rebel as a child, and he is drafted into World War II. He's drafted into the Air Force. His plane gets shot down, and he lands in the Pacific Ocean. He somehow survives for longer than you would ever expect anyone to survive. Him and his 2 or 3 other people with him in this life raft. And they don't even have anything in the life raft. Like, this life raft is missing a lot of the basic things that a life raft would have been stocked with, but this particular plane was older and it didn't have these really necessary items that would have really helped them, and so they somehow survive. They're being attacked by sharks. It's crazy. It's hard to believe that this is real. It's just such a crazy story. And then to make things worse, they get captured by the Japanese, and that is a whole other terrible ordeal. And the Japanese just did not treat their prisoners of war well at all. They treated them like animals. They didn't treat them like humans. The Japanese were very, very ruthless to their prisoners of war. He comes out of it somehow, has all these problems, has a lot of PTSD, and his marriage is falling apart. I'm really kind of spoiling this whole book for you, but I just think it's it's still a great story. Even if you don't want to hear about it, then you probably should go. But his marriage is falling apart. He's very jaded by the world. He goes to a Billy Graham crusade, which was a big thing that was happening back then, and it changes his life. He becomes a Christian. He learns how to forgive the people that hurt him. He tries to reconnect with some of the people that hurt him, some of the Japanese that hurt him, and I thought it was just a beautiful story of forgiveness. It was amazing to me that all this really happened to one person. And it was just so beautiful to me that God can use your life to bring other people healing. We have to forgive those around us that do us harm, and for our own sake, we have to let go of the things that have happened to us and the pain that we've gone through. And this is just, wow. I realize I've told you almost the whole book now, but it's still worth reading, okay? You still should read this book. I didn't tell you all of it. There's a lot of things that you can get out of this book, but wow. Wow, wow, wow. One of my favorite books probably of all time. I'll stop talking now. Those are my favorite books that I read this year. It was such a good reading year for me. I'm so very pleased. I hope that 2020 is going to be just as much fun. I hope that I can keep up my reading pace and read at least 50 books again and just have a lot of great books to talk about by the end of next year too. Let me know down below what were your favorite books that you read this year, or what was your one favorite if you want. Let me know let me know if you intend on reading any of these, or if you have read any of these books. I'd love to chat about them with you. I hope you're having a safe holidays and a very happy new year, and may your 2020 reading be everything that you hoped for. I hope your 2019 reading was great. Keep reading great books, and I will see you in my next video. Bye-bye.